In our study of the practice of the yoga of integral knowledge, Sri Aurobindo has shown us the first few steps of separating from the body consciousness, the emotional being and life energies, and even from the mind as the activity of thought and the thinker. And we come to rest at the witness in the mind. One more step is needed, which is the dissolution of the ego sense itself. And this is the theme of the present chapter, the release from the ego. Here, Sri Aurobindo describes how the formation of the mental and vital ego tied to the body sense was the first great labor of the cosmic life, because it was the only means by which it could form a conscious individual emerging out of matter. But on the other hand, he also observes the dissolution of this limiting ego is the one condition, the necessary means for this very cosmic life to arrive at its fruition. This whole idea that the ego was a necessary step and its dissolution is now the next necessary step is abbreviated in a very brief formulation, an aphorism that is part of a series of other aphorisms that come together in a little booklet called Thoughts and Aphorisms. This is distinct, Thoughts and Glimpses, which is distinct from Thoughts and Aphorisms. Here he discusses he covers many short aphorisms dealing with knowledge, will, enjoyment. And then comes the idea of individuality. And there, a brief aphorism. When we have passed beyond individualizing, then we shall be real persons. Ego was the helper, ego is the bar. And so the whole concept is encapsulated in this, that at an early stage of evolution, ego is the helper. It allows us to develop an individuality. But the individuality is not the person. It is only a means for the true person to organize himself in what would otherwise be a general mass of formless consciousness. And so, when we have passed beyond individualizing, then we shall be real persons. So first step is an individualizing, and then we have to go beyond individualizing. That's when the real person comes forward. And in the first step, ego is the helper. For the next step, ego is the bar. And the word is very suggestive. It's not that the ego is a troublemaker. It is a bar. It is literally a line that says you cannot cross unless you get free of the ego. But before that, in the formation of individualizing, ego is the helper. And it is by the means of the ego motives, ego drives, ego identities that we develop this sense of individuality. So, this is further elaborated by another aphorism that goes like this: transform the divided individual into the world personality. Let all thyself be the divine. This is thy goal. This is again a part of a series of other aphorisms dealing with knowledge, will, and enjoyment. And here again, the whole solution is given in a very brief aphorism. As a divided individual, that's when we have the ego sense, that divided individual has to be transformed into the world personality. That means there is a personality, there is something distinct and unique that you express, and yet the scope of the consciousness is in union with the whole world. Transform the divided individual into the world personality. He does not say enlarge, because we discussed this briefly last time. It is not by a successive enlargement that one attains to that. It would only be a larger and larger ego. Even one can have something which is like an ego at a cosmic scale, but it would still be ego. So it is a transformation. It moves from something to something which it is not essentially. It is not merely an aggrandizement. And the means for this transformation, let all thyself be the divine. This is thy goal. So the means is also given encapsulated. This chapter, in a sense, elaborates on this very pithy aphoristic formulation, but goes into very deep elaboration, looks at all the nuances, all the complexities of the problem. As we saw last time, if we do not deal with the complexities, eventually we always find ourselves stuck in some situation, not knowing what is right or how to deal with it. And in this larger complexity, Sri Aurobindo places before us all the possible options which humanity has formulated in its experience. And there are broadly two camps. One camp which deals with the materialistic perspective of the universe and a materialistic goal, which within that also subdivides, but which looks at the fulfillment of the individual ego as the most important thing because it is the greatest creation of our evolution, or another variation to that which looks at the fulfillment of the race and the collective ego as the greater good, or looks at the ego itself as something which will dissolve in the passing of the life, and therefore gives the full importance to the group identity. On the other hand, the other systems which take their stance on religious thought and spiritual disciplines, we find again a divergence. You have the Buddhist which denies the idea of a real self, admits no universal or transcendent being presiding over. The Advaitin declares the individual soul to be none other than the Supreme Self and Brahman, but individuality itself is an illusion, and putting off the individual existence is the only release. And other systems, in complete contradiction, declare that the human soul is always eternal, and the multiplicity of consciousness in the one is a reality, a spiritual truth, and the separate entity is a real, constant and imperishable truth, can never merge and dissolve into the oneness of the divine. So we have a full spectrum before us of possibilities dealing with the ego. Of these, we have chosen the second group generally, which has to do with the spiritual development, which views in whatever sense the common feature there is transcendence of the ego and a certain purification of it. And Sri Aurobindo then comes to the core of the problem of ego. Ego is in its nature smallness of being and brings with it four distortions. First, it brings contraction of consciousness, limitation of knowledge, and disabling ignorance. This is one. And we are stuck in that ignorance. The second is confinement and diminution of power, and therefore incapacity and weakness. And the third is the schism of oneness, and with that comes disharmony and failure of sympathy and love and understanding. And finally, there is the fragmentation of delight, with which comes pain and sorrow. All these four, ignorance, weak incapacity, disharmony, and suffering, are the outcome of the smallness. So the solution for this is for the smallness to go away. The ego must either disappear in impersonality or fuse into a larger I. It must fuse in the wider cosmic I, which comprehends all these smaller selves, or the transcendent, of which even the cosmic self is a diminished image. And this is what we saw last time. We stopped here. The essential idea is for the small I to lose itself and to merge in a greater truth. That is either the cosmic I or the transcendent. Now, before we can proceed with the means, it is extremely important to recognize in what way or what it means to live in the cosmic I or in the transcendence, and what is the dissolution of the smallness in the cosmic I. Because the obvious thinking of the human mind is to take what we already know, and then exaggerate or expand it to fit what we do not know. This is the reason why whenever a great truth descends on humanity, we find a way to corrupt it. Rather than accepting something which is greater than what we know, which means giving up what we know, we take what we know and then extend and twist it to fit what is coming, or we receive what comes and twist and fit it into what we know. Either way, there is a distortion, and we remain stuck in our own erroneous idea, now mixed in or distorted by something greater. So when we speak of the cosmic I, the cosmic self, the normal way of thinking for human beings is simply to extend and exaggerate my sense of I to the scale of the cosmos. And that is cosmic consciousness, isn't it? I imagine myself, my body itself as big as the universe. I imagine my consciousness wandering, looking at the whole cosmos, or even feeling myself extended into the whole cosmos. And so that must be cosmic consciousness. And in the text of Savitri, Sri Aurobindo describes this as the way of the Asura. This is the error that the Asura makes, to make his ego as big as the universe and then claim this is divinity. So here Sri Aurobindo is now going to clarify what this means when we speak of a cosmic I, and then in what way this differs even from a larger altruistic collective identity. Because even those could be seen as selflessness or transcendence of ego when you serve humanity and so on. But there is a difference. It is not yet a freedom from ego. And so these are important, fine distinctions, but they lay the base for the means by which we attain to that. And so that we don't stop halfway and we don't make an error in between. But this cosmic self is spiritual in essence and in experience. It must not be confused with the collective existence, with any group soul, or the life and body of a human society, or even of all mankind. So the nature of the cosmic self is not just a larger group. It is essentially a spiritual self. The collective existence is nothing but a large cluster of individuals. When he uses this word, the small ego must fuse in the cosmic I, which comprehends all these smaller selves. The word comprehend includes all of the small which are a part of it. They come together in this larger I, but it embraces them but also transcends them. It is larger, something different. It's not just a collection of the smaller I's or any collective existence. Group soul, life and body of human society, or even all mankind. We can take various degrees. In modern New Age discussions, this mistake is often made. There's a very well-known teacher in the West who has even used the word supermind in this sense. He respects Sri Aurobindo highly, has perhaps even absorbed some of the ideas from Sri Aurobindo's writings. But he uses the word supermind to describe a group soul identity. Meaning his community, his group, his followers form an identity and a mind which comprises the group, and that is supermind. And one can of course use words in any sense. But the problem with this is, first of all, it does not fit the correct etymology of super mind. But of course one could distort to fit anything. But it creates a great confusion. Because now you will have groups of people using this word in a completely different sense and yet trying to dialogue, and you'll have a great confusion. So such is the nature of a lot of communications across different traditions. Whatever the vocabulary, we make this distinction that no group identity, no collective existence, even on the scale of all of humanity, none of those is the cosmic self. And Sri Aurobindo puts it in the context of the current world thought. The subordination of the ego to the progress and happiness of the human race is now a governing idea in the world's thought and ethics. But this is a mental and moral and not a spiritual ideal. Remember, he has written this 100 years ago, almost to the year. 1916 would be around the time when these chapters would have been written. At that time, the governing idea in the world's thought and in the world's ethics is the subordination of the ego to the progress and happiness of the human race. You can see how this idea is even stronger today, but it's coming in a different way, and it's useful to observe the differences. At that time, this kind of thinking had begun. There was, all over the world, an idea of a great progress in humanity. A lot of it was ascribed to the new discoveries of science. Science will solve all the problems. Rationality will help us remove the confusion. And all of us working together can make humanity make great progress. But working together for the human progress means somewhere each one of us has to set aside our personal needs, our personal progress for the purpose of the group progress. And this had seized on the mind of humanity in a new way. And always a new thought that comes, because of its freshness, has a greater power. So we saw everywhere in the world people working in large collectives for common cause. Often this took the form of a national cause. So you will see nationalism had a great force then. Nationalism as a great truth had come forward, but was quickly distorted into national ego identities. The most extreme result of this was the great wars, the First World War and the Second World War, which were all built on these identities, and the idea, which derives from there, of one nationality being greater than another, or one race being superior to another and therefore dominating another, and so on. And so you see there, while people came together to serve a great national ideal, a great goal of the collective progress, whatever level of the collective they stopped at became now the larger ego sense. My race or my nationality, for whom I give and we all work together for a progress, now in contradiction to another race or nationality which perhaps because it is inferior, less developed, less capable, or I feel mine superior, should then serve this larger goal of my identity. And so you have again the ego conflicts on an exaggerated scale. And the same could happen even on the scale of humanity. Ronald Reagan, twice as President of the United States, spoke of this idea, once in the United Nations in a public speech, and another time in a private discussion with Gorbachev. He said how easily humanity would come together if all of Earth was attacked by aliens from other planets. And there's a great truth to that. One of the easiest ways to rally people is to find an external common threat. And I'm taking this example because this is being used at present very powerfully to try to bring together humanity, but again on false foundations. We have been offered, during the Cold War, there was this idea of the other, the evil empire, which is now trying to take over the world, so we should all rally together to oppose its evil intentions. Subsequent to that, we have now this idea of terrorism. And there is some kind of an unseen, undefined terrorist identity. The Al-Qaeda is suddenly across 100 countries, and it happened overnight. Or today it is the ISIS, which is all over. And we have to unify ourselves against this threat. And somehow it is built on a fear or a hatred of some common enemy around which we rally together, the group identity. Collectives on the scale of nationalities, but even transcending nationalities. And under this common fear, we are willing to set aside our personal freedom, our personal requirements, suffer together as a group in order that everybody can be better protected. For your own protection, for your own good, you have to suffer. And people willingly accept this. And this is being done very carefully, in a very organized way, across humanity on a global scale. But you can see how these are fundamentally falsehoods. The need to protect from a common enemy is not a lasting truth. It is not a truth of the inner being, of the soul, of the self, of the divinity. The spiritual truth is union around an innate foundation of a spiritual consciousness, a universal consciousness, an eternal truth, which is already there within us as our deepest truth, to find ourselves and discovering in that a common unity is the spiritual way. But here, what is being done through all these means is to bring the egos together to form a larger ego against something else. And so what happened 100 years ago, in a different way, was perhaps necessary as a phase because it was a first attempt on a large scale to forge some kind of unity. But those experiments having failed, today it is being as if enforced by an external threat. And the next step will be, as if things are moving in that direction, to organize all humanity under a common framework of a world government. And you can see steady progress in that direction, all for your own good. And Sri Aurobindo touches this subsequently. He describes this as a dark condition. So the subordination of the ego to the progress and happiness of the human race is now a governing idea in the world's thought and ethics. But this is a mental and moral and not a spiritual ideal, because it is still subordination to something else. It is not a true freedom, which would be the true nature of spirituality. For that progress is a series of constant mental, vital and physical vicissitudes. It has no firm spiritual content and offers no sure standing ground to the soul of man. Vicissitudes, steps, stages, constantly changing, new transitions. But all of them, all these stages and transitions are mental, vital and physical. Things are changing, therefore we have to adapt. Now there's a new fashion of a new value system, we adapt. New ideas come in, we change. But in all this, what's real? What is true? What is lasting? What is spiritual? Nothing. In fact, the last 100 years, you will see in most of humanity these series of vicissitudes, something moving to give way to something else, and so on. There's almost as if in the domain of ideas even, things which are fashionable, sometimes they come up as keywords. A fashionable keyword, a fashionable idea seizes on people, and for a while everybody is talking about it. Then it's old, and something else which is now new and exciting takes its place. But what is lasting and real through it all, we do not see anything. And there is, he says, no sure standing ground to the soul of man. Now we cannot understand what this means unless we take an example of what would comprise as a sure standing ground for the soul of man. We could look at it in different ways. If, for example, the whole focus of human society was to support the inmost soul in humanity and in the individual, if our whole education system itself began by looking at the child not as a potential worker in society, not as a potential leader or thinker or scientist or whatever, but as a conscious soul in evolution, and assist the child to develop that innate potential. If the whole organization of society was based on not laws, systems, moralities and ethics, but on creating spaces where the deepest aspiration of the soul could be actualized most easily, most effectively. In the past, it was the concept of dharma which was the foundation for such an attempt. But the form of it necessarily was relevant to that age. If today it has to be recreated, it would find new forms. But just this thought that there is something more profound and permanent in each one, individually and even at a collective level, that each community, each culture, each nationality has its own unique soul imprint which needs to be fulfilled in the larger evolution. And that kind of thinking and a society organized around these values would offer a standing ground for the soul of man. But in what is currently happening in the mental, vital and physical vicissitudes, there is nothing which supports the soul. The consciousness of collective humanity is only a larger, comprehensive addition or a sum of individual egos. So when we bring humanity together, let's say we all organize humanity around the United Nations. And in the framework of the United Nations, let's say the whole of the earth is now organized. What do you really have is just one more gigantic edition of the ego. Made of the same substance, in the same mold of nature, it has not in it any greater light or any more eternal sense of itself, any purer source of peace, light, any purer source of peace, joy, and deliverance. It is rather even more tortured, troubled, and obscured. Certainly more vague, confused, and unprogressive. Now, when we look at these few words which he puts together, there's a whole discussion one could build around it, which Sri Aurobindo has developed, in fact, in his writings on the ideal of human unity, where he shows how even humanity coming together as a world government, organizing itself, but on foundations which are primarily mental, vital, and physical, would not be a solution. It would in fact be worse, because it is made of the same substance and mold of nature. There is no greater light, no eternal sense of itself, no purer source of peace, joy, and deliverance. All of these would be characteristics which are spiritual. So let's review them and see how that works within us on an individual level. Greater light. What does it mean for us at an individual level to have a greater light than our intellect or our desires or some moral or ethical values? When we become conscious of the deeper soul within us, which is neither moral nor ethical nor rational nor emotional, but knows things in their deeper truth, knows itself in a deeper truth, knows others in their deeper truth, and sees the truth in circumstances. Or a higher intuitive illumination which sees the soul of things, knows them in right relation, and therefore knows the right action. These would be deeper sources of, greater sources of light. But the same can happen at a collective level. When a collectivity comes together, rather than starting our discussions in the consciousness in which we already live, and then quarreling and coming to some kind of a compromise, if each person makes an effort to align with their soul and open to a higher intuition, the group itself as a whole deepens and rises. And suddenly the dynamic of the group changes. We find some kind of a spontaneous harmony emerging. Things just fall into place. Everybody feels a commonality on a deeper level, not just because we have to face a common problem, but a deeper sense of identity. Something deeper comes forward at a group level, and the same can happen ultimately for the whole of humanity. When that happens, then we would have truly a spiritual foundation for the human life. Second thing he refers to is more eternal sense of itself. Who am I? Well, I am this person who was born of these parents, living in these circumstances, doing this job, and with these particular difficulties and likes and dislikes. And that's all there is. But if there is a deeper sense of who we are, we have a sense of purpose, we feel our life sacred, we feel some deeper meaning, something to be fulfilled, something to be realized, which is greater than I, for which this personality and these circumstances are a means. But we feel as a living force that deeper truth of who we are. Perhaps even in that, a sense of eternity, a sense of immortality, timelessness. And in that perhaps a sense of a common purpose. All of these awakening in the collectivity of humanity would be a meaningful step in the spiritual evolution of humanity. And finally, he speaks of a purer source of peace, joy, and deliverance. What do we mean by peace in our normal human life? It means absence of conflict, or a state of exhaustion in which there is no energy for conflict. Often we find we cannot sleep unless we drive ourselves to exhaustion, and then I get a peaceful sleep. If I am too fresh, then I am stuck in activity, I am unable to sleep. Exhaustion is a state in which the activity is no more possible and therefore there is no conflict happening within me and so I feel peaceful. It's not a real peace. It is inability to enter into conflict. Equally, the other form of peace, when there is an absence of conflict, is not a true peace. The true peace is a consciousness in which we feel something which is eternal as a substance, which is a real peace of self. And until we have touched that, we do not know what is true peace. That exists in itself, irrespective of circumstances. Even when circumstances are troubled, even when my consciousness is agitated, deep behind one feels this foundation of a peace. Its emergence, its influence filling the rest of my being brings automatically a stillness and an active form of peace, fullness, and joy similarly, and deliverance from our incapacity and ignorance. So these are the directions in which Sri Aurobindo is pointing to as the nature of the cosmic self. But right now we're looking at the group identity, and of this he says it is even more tortured, troubled and obscured than the individual. How is it so? If it's not obvious, what is obvious, he says, is certainly more vague, confused and unprogressive. So in a group situation where each one is asserting their own ego claim, notice that the moment one person tries to grow, he breaks the current balance of organization and the whole group consciousness will pull him down because it breaks the harmony which is settled. All right, we're all working in a settled harmony, we all know each other's weaknesses and strengths, and somehow now we have come to some kind of stable working, no more are we in conflict. The moment one person moves forward, there's a breakdown of this, a conflict begins, a tension is felt, and everybody, the pack, leaps on him to pull him down back. And so unprogressive is the most obvious form in which the group collective ego takes. You will see this in the decline and fall of all great civilizations. At first, the drive of the civilization is some ideal, some great idea, some sense of purpose, which makes it move forward. Subjugate their personal needs to this larger collective need. And so everything seems to move well. Once it has reached some kind of an peak, there is a rearrangement, a stabilization, new organization becomes stable. And at that point, suddenly it stops progressing, cannot grow. Mental, vital and spiritual ideals always have a limit where they have to stop progressing. So mental, vital and physical ideals always have a limit they cannot grow beyond, because that's the nature of things which are finite. Only a spiritual ideal can continue to grow unendingly, whether at an individual or at a collective scale. And so whenever there's this group progress, it comes to a stop. After that, because things cannot change, there's no possibility of progress, it effectively becomes a decline. And helplessly, anybody tries to prevent the decline is blocked, because it destabilizes the current harmony. And there's a vague identity. There's a confused sense of the group. These are most obviously seen, but with that, there is a tortured, troubled and obscured consciousness, because the individual within each is still aspiring for progress. Even if for a moment you've set aside your personal needs for the collective growth, there is a need which is affirming, pushing forward, and it has to be held back and is blocked. So something within us feels a disconnect from the collective growth, and there is a pain. Between individuals, while we have subjugated our individual conflicts for a common purpose, the conflicts are not gone. And they are brewing behind the scenes. There is, even as the group proceeds, between those at the top, a subtle tension which grows. Is that person doing more than I? Is he more popular than I? And so on. And this is why you will see eventually, whenever the civilizations in conflict or groups in conflict reach a point where one has now definitely overcome another, splits begin, divisions begin, and that becomes its own undoing. And tortured as a group itself, it is tortured because something is suffocating throughout. The individual is in this respect greater than the mass and cannot be called on to subordinate his more luminous possibilities to this darker entity. This group soul, and especially if the earth is organized as a world government, it would be, Sri Aurobindo observes, a very regressive step. It would prevent all future progress, and it would be a dark situation from which to break out would be extremely difficult, because once the organization has set, it will ensure that nothing can question or oppose. Some of this tendency is already happening when we see people, many countries, being organized more and more around what appears to be a police state, a kind of a dictatorship within the framework of what is a democracy. We still see effectively a dictatorship of the system. People may change, but the system is becoming more and more oppressive. And within that, the individual is greater than the mass and should not be called to subordinate his luminous possibilities, because in the individual is the progress. The collective can progress only when its individuals progress. So here comes the tricky balance. For the collective evolution, it seems as if individuals need to subjugate their personal needs to the larger group. And yet the purpose of the collective should not suffocate the individual. The ideal organization is when the collective is organized to support the individual progress. And to that end, each individual subjugates some personal needs. And it's a very tricky balance, not at all obvious. But when the individual consciousness rests not on the ego drives, but on some deeper spiritual foundations, this becomes automatic and spontaneous. If light, peace, deliverance, a better state of existence are to come, they must descend into the soul from something wider than the individual, but also from something higher than the collective ego. So here two words come. There is the widening and then the heightening. The ego, collective, remains always at a low level. There has to be a higher truth which encompasses, comprehends, but is not of the nature and substance of the ego consciousness. Just as there can be a widening of consciousness which is not a narrow individuality, but a personality which is cosmic. So here, the first obvious tendency, and it's often associated with spirituality, is philanthropy, altruism, service to mankind. And you will find practically all spiritual movements in the world are seen to be participating in such activity. Often in human society they are valued in terms of these activities. I've seen many new upcoming, let's say, spiritual leaders and movements around them at close hand. And everywhere you will find themselves defining themselves by their altruistic activities, charity, philanthropy, service to mankind, etc. In one particular case of a very popular upcoming leader, before he comes on stage for his lecture or interview, whatever form it takes, they will show a video. And the video lasts almost 10 minutes, showing him working with poor children, disabled people, planting trees, opening schools, meeting oppressed, traveling all over the world and meeting precisely the groups most needy. Needy in what way? Financially, socially, economically, educationally, and so on. And you ask yourself, where is the spirituality? Well, you could still say Since spirituality cannot be demonstrated in a video, you have to show activities in life. But when you observe the communications in the movement, the priorities in the movement, they all tend to have social forms, social objectives, or even economic objectives. Through that, somehow, there'll be greater peace in the world. So they work for world peace by bringing about social change. And that's already, you can see, not going to work. At least you will not have a real peace. You will have absence of conflict, one step of improvement, social progress, all of which is good, but it's not spiritual, it's not liberating in consciousness. So this is what Sri Aurobindo now takes up as discussion. Altruism, philanthropy, the service of mankind are in themselves mental or moral ideas, not laws of the spiritual life. This is a very important statement and is in direct contradiction to the popular conception of spirituality. When common society, common man, is presented somebody as a spiritual leader, the first thing they look for is social service, etc. Sri Aurobindo's ashram, oh yes, he has an ashram in Pondicherry. Where is the social service? Have you opened hospitals? Are you doing free education for the poor? What kind of ashram is this? What kind of spirituality is this? Well, it's one of those newfangled things. It's not so interesting. But when you say none of these, altruism, philanthropy and service to mankind, none of these are laws of a spiritual life. They are just mental and moral ideals. It's turning the conventional idea completely on the head. It's even saying you can be spiritual without any of these moral or social objectives. Doing none of these, you can still be spiritual. Yes, of course, we have great examples. But in the popular mind, still this association is strong. If in the spiritual aim there enters the impulse to deny the personal self or to serve humanity or the world at large, it comes not from the ego nor from the collective sense of the race, but from something more occult and profound, transcendent of both these things. If at all these impulses come into the spiritual. Let's take a few examples. Ramana Maharshi is perhaps one of the most obvious, where you do not see him opening schools or doing social charity service, etc. Perhaps the closest to that you might see is he would prepare food for people every day. And the kitchen would be open to all the disciples, all those who came anytime for free. And that continues to this day. But that's about all that one saw in terms of any social action. There were others who did not even do that. Even today, there are those who live in their caves, stay away from others, and are even unsocial in ways. There is in the same mountain of Arunachala where Ramana Maharshi stayed, there is one sage who lives in a little cave, crouched up inside, very small space. And if anybody approaches, he starts throwing stones to shoo them away, because he doesn't want to be disturbed by them. There are other sages, saints, who have even been abusive of anybody coming to disturb them. The famous example in the life of Alexander, he went to a sage and said, well, I am Alexander, you do not know who I am. The man says, it doesn't matter. So the man says, I am conquering the world, what can I do for you? And the sage says, please move aside, you're blocking the sun. That's one good thing you can do for me. But that's about all that I need. But that kind of a dismissiveness even, and in the most ascetic traditions this has been valued as a sign of great spirituality, a disdain for things mundane, material, and even disrespectful of power and strength. In the life of Mahatma Gandhi, we have this example of a very rich person coming to give him a check of a very large sum in those days. And Gandhiji tore it and threw it away. I don't need great wealth. It's presented by his devotees as a sign of spirituality. That he chose to live in bare clothes or in a house which had barrenness is again presented as a sign of spirituality. But these are again social and moral, they are not in themselves spiritual. On the other extreme, we have examples of great spiritual beings who lived in extreme luxury without being attached to it. The greatest example in the Indian tradition is King Janaka, who is the father of Sita. He is presented as one of the great examples, living within the royalty of the palace, with all the responsibilities of the king and all the splendor of the kingly life. He is attached to nothing. And there's a whole incident describing how a sage comes to him, revealing to him the knowledge of Brahman. And in the midst of this revelation, his courtiers come saying, "Your palace is on fire." And he says, "Don't disturb me now, I'm receiving the knowledge of Brahman." And at that point, you see how the man is not in any way affected by the things of the material life. Nothing of all those palaces he is attached to. In the face of a knowledge which is so great and so valuable, even the destruction of everything that he has is acceptable. And it shows that he was free. And the whole thing is, of course, in the story, at the end, we discover it was on an illusion created. So, we are seeing here a very different perspective of spirituality, where neither we seek disdain for matter, nor aggrandized enjoyment and attraction to material things. It is innately a consciousness that is free, and in its freedom it can accept and deal with all the extremes, from extreme poverty to extreme riches, with equality, and make the best of each of these. For what? What is it that makes you spiritual when either you work for humanity or you deny yourself and commit to a larger action in the world? He says, it is not from the ego, nor from the collective sense of the race, but from something more occult and profound, transcendent of both these things. You have ego, you have collective ego, the ego of the race. There's something deeper transcending both. What is that? For it is founded on a sense of the divine in all, and it works not for the sake of ego or the race, but for the sake of the divine and its purpose in the person or group or man collective. So the one thing which makes it spiritual is the recognition of the divinity in things, in people, in all forms, both individual forms and group identities, where it sees the divine and it serves the divine. That is what would make it a spiritual person aiming to serve or having an impulse to deny personal self to serve humanity or the world. We see this in the example of Swami Vivekananda. Ramakrishna Paramahansa himself was almost bordering on the ascetic in his life. Not that he had any obvious disdain for wealth or comfort. It's just, it was the part, an imprint of his nature, that he didn't wish these or even found them somehow repugnant to his personal means. But they were acceptable in whatever context life offered to others. So you see nothing after him. No movement he created, no institutions, nothing at all. Had it not been for Swami Vivekananda as his chief disciple, with him the whole thing would have faded out. He had a group of his immediate disciples, many of whom had attained to self-realization, and as they passed away, the whole thing would have faded out. Only the memory of the place he lived and his teaching would remain. But Swami Vivekananda, as his successor, formally anointed, began a whole movement of Ramakrishna Mission, began to organize schools, began to reach out to work for the uplift of the poor, for social change, for education and so on, for action in life. But on a different foundation, all of them were monks, dedicating themselves to the service of humanity. And he spoke of this, he used the phrase, classical phrase in the yogic tradition, Daridra Narayana, God in the vesture of poverty, whom we serve. That is, in every poor person, although you see the dress of poverty, you are seeing God inhabiting, and it is God that you serve when you reach out to change their condition externally. That being the goal, obviously in practice, when you organize it at an institutional level, that remains an ideal, and the form then eventually boils down to simply doing it for the sake of doing. Well, now you have an institution, you have schools, you have to keep them running, you have to open ashrams and so on. Sri Aurobindo himself avoided creating any movements. The goal was very focused. There was a small community set for attaining to, for realizing something individually and in the collectivity of life. It stopped with that. Whatever impact it would have on the larger humanity would be incidental, not by going out, especially not by going out prematurely. Sri Aurobindo himself, the mother explains, had plans for organizing many centers all over India for the awakening of the nation, but on spiritual foundations. But this awakening itself would be subsequent to the establishment of that higher consciousness in the collective, in the ashram. And that is why you will see it was only after 1956, once the supramental manifestation had taken place, that the mother allowed the larger expansion through the opening of centers when devotees wanted to do that, starting study circles, organizing subsequently when other devotees wanted to organize these centers to allow for the creation of the society. Then, most important, the expansion of what was attempted at the scope of the ashram to the scope of Auroville, on the scale of a township, where all of humanity would be impacted. Again, not by reaching out in an activism, but by creating a representative space in which humanity could come together through its representatives to realize on a small scale this ideal. And so always the focus was a small group, maybe a widening small group, widening of circumstances, but a small group of committed people in whom something higher could be organized, and through it a natural rippling out. This is the reason why you will find, although there are many centers all over the world, study circles, centers in Sri Aurobindo's name, centers in the name of Auroville, you will not find any of them rapidly expanding. You will find them there, people coming together, studying, reading, or sometimes even many of them quickly fall into disuse because there are not enough people. But there is no activism, there is no attempt to increase numbers or expand. Even when the Sri Aurobindo Society was started as a way of organizing centers, the first guideline mother gave, propagation but not propaganda. It's a very subtle difference, but so significant. Propagation means you make available, she said, you make available the knowledge, the teaching, for those who are interested. And those who are interested will come, make use of it, partake of it in the way they find helpful, to the extent they find helpful, and perhaps form a natural collective for a common sharing and growth, but no propaganda of going out to preach and teach. When my teacher, M.P. Pandit, was invited to speak at the All India Radio and subsequently to other public fora, it was a point of doubt that he got clarified from the mother. And her guideline was very specific. She said, you do not speak of the teachers first. You communicate the ideals, you communicate the ideas, And when people are touched by that and they ask, well, where is this from? Then you give the source, the names of the teachers. And he followed that generally in his life. Of course, wherever he went, it would be known he is coming from the Sri Aurobindo ashram. In his speech, there would occasionally be this mention, Sri Aurobindo says this, when it differentiates from others in a significant way. But it is only when the ideas were caught that people would say, oh, then we need to study, who is this Sri Aurobindo? And then he would speak about Sri Aurobindo's life and the overall details. So there were even situations, I heard this narration recently, when he was invited by the Theosophical Society in America at a major function, and all the big names were present. It was a large conference, many people spoke, and afterwards when Panditji spoke, it was as if everything that had been discussed earlier fell into place in a grand vision. And afterwards, immediately after, everybody came up to him, to the stage, and they said, we have known all these things, because all these ideas are part of the higher mind of humanity. But we never heard it presented in such a comprehensive and clear way, integrating all these pieces together in one vision. Where is this from? Who is your teacher? And so he was invited to speak again in a second session where he spoke of Sri Aurobindo and the mother and the teaching. So this was the general approach that the mother had highlighted. And because this is the nature of the force of their manifestation, even when people have attempted, and we know of cases where people have attempted to create a propagandist form, it quickly withers or takes a different turn which is no more aligned to the teaching of Sri Aurobindo. I'm mentioning these things because these are things which are useful for us to understand. Often we meet people who will say, oh, Sri Aurobindo, he is more than 100 years. How many followers does he have? How many centers do you have? How many schools have you opened? And somehow that's not the reference. So you see in the life of Swami Vivekananda, this clear turn to a collective action, and there are letters regarding this to Sri Aurobindo. People ask, yes, but you say that there is no need for a social action, etc., but Swami Vivekananda did this. And Sri Aurobindo explains that that kind of a social action was not the central mission either of Ramakrishna Paramahansa or Swami Vivekananda. It was not their central spiritual teaching. If anything, he says, it was the particular turn of his nature. That is, in his nature there was a need to express himself in that particular way, and so the spiritual power that he embodied took that form. But the teaching itself is not dependent on this kind of a social activism. And if at all, that's why he says, if in the spiritual aim there enters the impulse to deny the personal self or to serve humanity or the world at large, it comes not from the ego nor from the collective sense of the race, but from something more occult and profound, which is, he says, the sense of the divine in all. For the sake of the divine and its purpose in the person or the race or man collective. Now this distinction is very suggestive. There is the person, there is the race. And then he uses a third term, man collective. What is that? And how is it different from the race? So we looked at these two examples, how the individual ego and a cluster of individual egos forms the group ego and the race ego. But then man collective and M capital is something different. It is not the group ego which is a combination of individuals. It is a deeper spiritual perception that there is in the collective consciousness and individuality which is emerging, which is not made up just of this cluster of individuals. It may use this cluster of individuals as its vehicles for expression, but it already exists. And this is a very deep spiritual truth. It is seen in not all collectives. Not all collectives have a soul of an individual spiritual being that for whom it is a vehicle. Sri Aurobindo uses this term in the context of nations. That certain nations, not the artificially formed nations, in the post-colonial phase, when colonization ended, often territories were cut up along straight lines or along lines of former ownerships of colonies, which were lines that were changing anyway. The First World War was fought over the colonies and their ownerships. But along those lines, being artificial divisions, do not represent the true sense of the national identities or the group souls. Many are artificial, and therefore you see even today a continuous flux even in their borders and conflict across borders. But where the organization was along national identities, you can recognize a certain nation type, a nation consciousness, and behind that a nation soul, which uses this nation vehicle as its means of manifestation. In another very suggestive discussion, Sri Aurobindo points to how nature created many group identities, from the individual to the family to the tribe to the community to the regional identities, national identities, and moving towards a global human identity. And of all these, nature has decided to discard all the intermediate steps, keeping only the individual, the family, the nation, and humanity. So from the individual, there are three groups: family, nation, and humanity. But in the initial formation of humanity, the other two would get weakened briefly before they find their new relation. But everything in between is being broken up quickly: the tribal identities, regional identities. But the nation identity she wants to keep. For this, there is a suggestion that there is a truth, a spiritual truth behind each nation. And equally at the level of all humanity, there is the man collective. One may even speak of an archetype of humanity which is presiding over, but it may be in this case something more specific to the earth. Or it could be something larger, which can be on a cosmic scale, which is the archetype of the human consciousness, the human race, even in all its variations across planets. But we see there a greater truth behind. So even in this, we see the divine embodied. This is a great principle which is described in the Veda. There is in the Veda the Purusha Sukta. It is a series of verses describing the divine as a being, as an individual being on a cosmic scale, but in the way he organizes himself in humanity. And it describes how he organizes himself through these limbs, and each of the limbs of society, and the four major limbs, and so on. But it is a truth which is spiritual. Seeing God in that, even on that scale, and serving that, that's the only way in which, in the spiritual aim, there can be a form like this, which looks similar to altruism or philanthropy or service to mankind, but is fundamentally different in motivation and experience. It is this transcendent source, that is the divine, which we must seek and serve, this vaster being and consciousness, to which the race and individual are minor terms of its existence. And then he, having said this, he is not discarding altruism and philanthropy straight away, showing its right place as an intermediate step to a greater consciousness. There is indeed a truth behind the pragmatic impulse which an exclusive, one-sided spirituality is apt to ignore or deny or belittle. It is this, that since the individual and the universal are terms of that higher and vaster being, their fulfillment must have some place, some real place in the supreme existence. So now you could have a spirituality which says, well, since none of these are essentials to spirituality, I will set aside service to humanity, service to the collective, even service to other individuals, because they're not essentially required for spirituality. And I will pursue a one-sided spirituality in exclusivity. So he says there is a possibility one could choose that, but then it is ignoring another side. And that side is this. Both the individual and the universal are terms of something higher. Both need to find their fulfillment in the higher spiritual development. And they were created, they were articulated by the divine in evolution for a reason. So he says, there must be behind them some high purpose in the supreme wisdom and knowledge, some eternal strain in the supreme delight. They cannot have been, they were not created in vain. We're talking of the individual and the universal terms of the higher and vaster being. So if you look at the divine as one being, one conscious being, even as a personality of the divine, that reflects in the individual beings and in the cosmic universal being. Both of these it has chosen to organize itself as. And therefore both are going to be terms of some fulfillment which it has in its purpose. To express his knowledge and to express his delight. We will see, and it is a suggestive idea which Sri Aurobindo places, it is there also in Thoughts and Glimpses and various other writings. We see there this idea that as the individual emerges and discovers his fulfillment in the one divine being and identifies, unites with the divine being, that individual becomes as if equivalent to the universal being in which the divine manifests. He experiences himself universally, transcendentally, and each person thus awakened experiences universally and transcendentally their deeper unity as well as their individuality. And what happens then is, in that universality of being, all these individuals become its representatives, unique representatives, each experiencing universality, manifesting universality, and yet together forming a vehicle for that universality, without ever losing the individual total freedom of their divinity. And this is a concept which can only exist in a consciousness liberated completely from ego. As long as you have any limitation, if you become a part of a whole, you will be like a cell subjugated to, losing freedom from in the larger identity. It is only when the one has become completely free that he can act almost as if like a cell and a vehicle of the collective without ever losing the freedom of individuality. And it is towards this that the future evolution, the spiritual evolution, and the play of the delight in forms and individualities is moving. That is the true sense of the Leela. But this Sri Aurobindo just points to, there must be a greater purpose, and leaves it there. But the perfection and satisfaction of humanity, like the perfection and satisfaction of the individual, can only be securely compassed and founded upon a more eternal yet unceased truth and right of things. Minor terms of some greater existence, they can fulfill themselves only when that of which they are the terms is known and possessed. So as long as we do not know that of which we are the expression, we cannot truly experience the right of things and the truth of things, and we cannot organize the perfection and satisfaction truly, both in the individual and the collective. So there is a double evolution, the individual evolution and the collective evolution. Both have to realize their source equally, because that which transcends is equally in the universal and equally in the individual. To that, the universal is no way greater than the individual. This is the reason why in human affairs we will find individuality and collectivity always seesawing. Sometimes individual seems greater, and so the collective gives in to individual freedom. And sometimes the collective seems greater and individuals have to subjugate to the collective development. Which is true? Neither is greater. Both are equally but distinct terms of something which transcends both. And yet in their organization, the individual is part of the collective. The collective is made up of the individual. So this view is not fully understood unless one rises above the conventional sense of space and time. If you see individual and collective only in terms of one including the other, then it seems obvious that the collective is greater than the individual. But you have to see differently. From a consciousness which is none of these, it puts all of itself to form the individual. It puts all of itself to form the collective. Only in the current organization of space, the individual is as if a part of the collective. But that is entirely here in the individual, and therefore the individual is as much important as the collective. Now, the moment you have set this as the base, there are two evolutions. There is an individual evolution and there is a collective evolution. The collective evolution is slower. It needs the progress of its individuals. The individual evolution is more rapid. It is not dependent on the progress of the others. That is why in a collective evolution, it is the individual evolution that leads first. But the individual evolution does not need the collective. It can go on independently. If it is supported by the collective, it can perhaps do much more in expressing itself, but not in its development. And so we will find in nature plays with both. Some species, she emphasizes the collective identity more. Some species, she emphasizes the individual identity more. But generally, when the psychic principle has to be developed, the individuality takes a greater place. In the human affairs, Mother observes that our physical earth, planet Earth, is a special center for evolution in the whole cosmos. Because this is where the psychic principle has been organized in its most complete way. It suggests to us that there are elsewhere species where the collective identity is stronger, as with bees, as with ants. Where individuality is present, yes, of course, as with bees and ants, but is naturally, instinctively subjugated to the species identity. But on Earth, there is something very distinct, where the individuality takes a stronger force. But the two are parallel evolutions, each nurturing the other. But there comes a time when the psychic being emerges, and especially in the context of the integral yoga, as we move towards a divine life, where individuals organize themselves to manifest divinity in a collective, on a collective scale. At that point, the psychic being itself, although individual, comes together in alignment with other psychic beings, and the evolution of the individual and the collective merge and fuse into each other. But this is something which belongs to the distant future, but we can see how nature has taken two different branches, but at some point on spiritual foundations they merge because their truth is one common origin. All of these are implied in what Sri Aurobindo is discussing, and we are, so to say, elaborating on it to understand this principle more deeply. And all of this helps us to understand the place of the ego and the true sense of the release from the ego. The greatest service to humanity, the surest foundation for its true progress, happiness and perfection, is to prepare or find the way by which the individual and the collective man can transcend the ego and live in its true self, no longer bound to ignorance, incapacity, disharmony and sorrow. Remember those four which we saw, which come from smallness. All these four we can get free of. But if you really want to serve humanity, he says, the best way is to prepare the way by which the individual and the collective can transcend the ego, or to find the way by which they can transcend the ego. So it is for this reason that we find this vocabulary, let us do the sadhana, let us work together in our collective space in the sadhana, and that is our best way to help humanity. It comes from this idea. Because this is the surest foundation for the true progress, happiness, and perfection. But it doesn't mean it is the only foundation. It is the surest foundation. All other possibilities are also valid. You can go out there and serve economically, socially, creatively, scientifically, artistically, etc. All of those will help to bring progress, happiness, and perfection. But all of those will be unstable as a means and cannot be foundations for a lasting happiness, progress, or perfection. The surest foundation will be this spiritual base in which we can get free of our ego sense. On that foundation, all other means will become suddenly amplified in their effectivity and will be able to rest securely and lead to lasting results. This is the reason why, although there are so many efforts even today, all over the world, for new social experiments, new economic experiments, eventually they tend always to collapse. Under the pressure of the breakdown, individually and collectively, because of ego limitations, which lead inevitably to ignorance, incapacity, disharmony, and sorrow. To the extent that a collectivity is able to free itself from the ego sense, both individually and collectively, it becomes less bound to ignorance, incapacity, disharmony, and sorrow, and therefore able to express more and more truly the true progress, happiness, and perfection. So now in this perspective, you can see how everything else has its place, has its legitimate place, but nothing can give a sure foundation unless this is done. And that's why the greatest service to humanity, the surest foundation for its true progress, happiness, and perfection, is the means for the individual and collective to transcend the ego and live in its true self. It's not enough to remove the ego, the true self has to come forward and take its place. I point now to that experiment which I mentioned earlier in one of the communities where he's organizing a group which he calls the Supermind. And when I interacted with that group, my sense was that he was the ego. The leader was the ego of the group. We see this in many cults, in many communities which have become too cultish, that the leader becomes the ego of the group. Others have their ego subjugated to serve this individual ego. The result is apparently in the group a weakening of the ego sense, but not really so, and often the leader, if he is himself not free from the ego, gets into a greater difficulty. It's only that the group ego has organized itself around the queen bee. If you hide the queen bee, it looks like the hive is pretty much egoless, they're all helping each other. But the reality is that the ego has only concretized itself around this special individual. And that's not a very helpful situation for the emergence of the soul. Neither of the soul of the collective nor of the soul of the individual. That's why the true test, whether a community is moving spiritually to its fulfillment, is to observe whether increasingly the soul of the individuals and the soul of the collective are coming forward. In its most external form also, sometimes it is symbolically seen. If you recall Mother's advice with Auroville. She said, Matrimandir is the spiritual center of Auroville. It is representative of the soul of Auroville. And what does that mean? Auroville as a collective has also a soul, and it is represented physically by this space that is Matrimandir. And so, she explained, the sooner the Matrimandir is built, the easier it will be for Auroville. And we can see how in the early stages, before the physical space of the Matrimandir was completed, we had many more difficulties. From the point where that external symbol and space where the spiritual soul of Auroville can be manifested is established, we see the difficulties becoming less obvious, less extreme, more easily resolvable, and so on. But I would say it would be essential for all individuals to use that physical space, to use the support of that physical symbol as an aid in order to help the emergence of the soul of the community. But this is an observation, perhaps a personal perspective. The point I want to get to is the measure of the growth of an individual and the collective is finally, from a spiritual perspective, only the measure of the emergence of its soul. It is by the pursuit of the eternal and not by living bound in the slow collective evolution of nature that we can best assure even that evolutionary, collective, altruistic aim our modern thought and idealism have set before us. So the modern thought and idealism speaks of all humanity must be able to live in comfort, all humanity must be happy, all humanity must work together, all humanity must have harmony, all must have equally the same opportunities, the same rights, the same values, the same equality, and so on. All of this being true, the best means to realize that is it for the slow evolutionary development of nature, but it is by pursuing the eternal as rapidly as possible, both individually and collectively. And it is thus that we speed up even nature's evolution. But it is in itself, this whole modern idealism, it is in itself a secondary aim. To find, know and possess the divine existence, consciousness and nature, and to live in it for the divine, is our true aim and the one perfection to which we must aspire. To find, know and possess the divine existence, consciousness and nature, and to live in it for the divine. So 4 steps. Find the divine. So in the first step, we enter into a relationship. Before that, what is this divine? Where is the divine? I don't know. But you have a few brief glimpses, a few points of contact. You feel something. And gradually a familiarity develops. And perhaps with that familiarity, an ability to enter in relation, perhaps at will, maybe involving a little bit of time. Perhaps it takes me an hour, it makes me half an hour, it takes me 5 minutes, or it takes me time, doesn't matter how much. But I know now and I can enter in relation with the divine. And so for me, the divine is a reality which I know. At that point, you have found the divine, and then to know him more and more deeply, intimately, to enter in that experience and know all the facets of it. That leads to the third step, possessing. And there comes a point where you feel a part of you always connected to and filled with, living in, merged with, in some part, however small, in that divine consciousness. That you say you have possessed it, you possess that divine consciousness. But existence, consciousness and nature, they are all 3 facets of the divine consciousness. You can know the divine in essentiality, you know it exists, I feel that presence. I am filled with its awareness, that's a different degree. And then the divine nature begins to manifest in me. I act by its values, its temperament, its substance. That's the third degree. So all of these would be degrees of possessing the divine consciousness. And after that comes the permanent living in it for the divine is our true aim and the one perfection to which we must aspire. That being the case, to the extent that we have responsibilities in the collective, we attempt to realize this in the collective also, in our relation with individuals, in our work and so on. But this is the one aim which we place before us. This being our goal, it is obvious that the way of the spiritual philosophies and religions and not the earthbound materialistic doctrine is closer to our way. So the materialistic doctrine said, well, altruism is good, you must help humanity, growth of collective, growth of species, etc. But Sri Aurobindo shows that even to do that, the best way is this. And so inevitably we come to the pursuit of the divine. And here we look at the spiritual philosophies, religions, etc. And there we recognize the common feature of the need to eliminate the ego. And what does that mean? That becomes the theme of the next discussion. You see how Sri Aurobindo has taken us through first a spectrum of all the possibilities. And then he shows you within all these possibilities, even if you accept the most limited, restricted and materialistic, to realize those truly, the others become necessary. And so now we turn completely to something which requires from us a spiritual development, even for material realization and material aims. We need a spiritual development, the common feature of which is the elimination of the ego. How far do we have to go in that? And the means becomes the next theme. So he prepares us for this. It is then in the way of the spiritual philosophies and religions, not in that way of the earthbound materialistic doctrine, that the seeker of the highest knowledge has to walk, even if with enriched aims and a more comprehensive spiritual purpose. So in the process of this discussion now, even our aim has become more enriched, our purpose more comprehensive, because now we include even the awakening of the collective, the transformation of the collective, the fulfillment of the divine in the collective as our goal, by recognizing the truth of the materialistic approaches. This is so characteristic of Sri Aurobindo. Nothing is entirely false. Nothing is to be eliminated in its essence. Everything has in its essence a deep truth which must be included in the larger spiritual goal. Not included merely as an add-on. Here you have a goal, you add this plus this plus this plus this to make it a comprehensive, complicated, added-on pieces. Rather, he shows at its essential, it is not only not contradictory, but it is complementary and fulfills the spiritual goal. And always the understanding of the spiritual goal enlarges and becomes more complete by taking the essential principle behind each thing. And this is how we should approach our life. Always recognize whenever something has the capacity to insist, it means there is a truth there. The truth may not be in the form. In fact, more likely, the form is falsified. The truth is in the essence behind the form. And so we make a conscious effort to see what is true behind this insistence. Once we can catch that and we identify that essential thing, and because it is in essence, it is not tied to form, we see how it aligns perfectly with our current goal. But in aligning with the goal, we see how it widens our understanding of things. And now we can include that essential principle and in the larger understanding, recast its form. And when the form is recast, it is no more contradicting, it is completing, making more perfect what we were doing. And that other person who was now opposing is seen to be included, he also feels satisfied that his point is accepted and the whole thing works in a larger unification, larger harmony. Of course, it means the particular form, which was perhaps limited or distorted, needs to be recast. But if the truth is taken, then the person feels satisfied and accepted automatically. And so this is a principle which we have to learn. And Sri Aurobindo leads us in these writings. They're so thick, so large, because he takes into account all of these fine distinctions which are necessary for the completion of the larger understanding. It would have been very simple to have said, forget all this, let's just focus on the practice, do this, 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 and where this is, you create a roadmap of a practice. But you can see how easily our misunderstandings would have remained and would have latched on to certain principles or forms and distorted them. Sri Aurobindo carefully takes this tangle of confusions of ideas, philosophies and truths, fragmented, untangles them, lays them out in alignment to each other, and we see how they are in perfect harmony with each other, none are contradicting, and then the whole thing rises in one comprehensive movement, the core of which is this spiritual awakening. And so around this clarified, harmonized vision of the truth in all its detail and complexity, he is able to easily articulate one single movement of consciousness with all variations of forms of practice. And we see now how these forms are not contradictory anymore. They only represent emphasis on particular aspects and facets. But there is a central column of the movement of consciousness. And the whole thing becomes so obvious, so simple. Now he brings us to the comprehensive, enriched aim in our spiritual purpose. The next question. But how far has he to proceed in the elimination of the ego? Because this is the common feature of all these approaches. In the ancient way of knowledge, we arrive at the elimination of the ego sense, which attaches itself to the body, to the life, to the mind, and says of all or any of them, this is I. But not only do we, as in the way of works, get rid of the I of the worker and see the way of work, and see the Lord alone as the true source of all works and sanction of works, and his executive nature power, or else his supreme Shakti as the sole agent and worker, but we get rid also of the ego sense, which mistakes the instruments or the expressions of our being for our true self and spirit. But even if all this has been done, something remains still. There remains a substratum of all these, a general sense of the separate I. This substratum ego is something vague, indefinable, elusive. It does not or need not attach itself to anything in particular as the self. It does not identify with anything collective. It is a sort of a fundamental form or power of the mind which compels the mental being to feel himself as a perhaps indefinable but still a limited being, which is not mind, life or body, but under which their activities proceed in nature. He's come to something essential in the whole sense of the ego. We've rapidly read through many lines which we will review next time. But in those lines, he shows us whatever the approaches we may follow, and even the earlier discussions of this book in the Yoga of Works, having come to this point, there is something that is indefinable, which is the essence of the ego sense. And he says, if that you do not get rid of and you identify with that, it is even possible to make a great error. He says, I am mind and life or body. Many think themselves released and mistake this elusive ego for the one, the divine, the true Purusha, mistaking the indefinable for the infinite. But for so long as this fundamental ego sense remains, there is no absolute release. And he says, if there is the error in identification, the ego life may, under that pretext, get rather exaggerated intensity and force. And even if you do not make that error, he says, you have still not attained to the true freedom. There is a shadow of the Purusha. You do not have the Purusha yet. Now, I've quickly read through, because this gives us the sense of where we are going from here. It gives us also the sense of the limitations of the current approaches in the way at least we have understood them. And Sri Aurobindo will take us to this essential thing behind and then show us the means by which we get free from that. So this discussion comes up next time. It is fascinating, very deep, and very liberating to our understanding as much as eventually to our experience. You can pause here and take up any questions or any comments. So I was speaking in the collective, in the psychic evolution, when I said the individual and the collective join. It's not two individuals. It is the whole sense of the collective itself which is evolving. If you take humanity as a whole, for example, or another species, let's say an animal species which is evolving, there is a collective evolution which is primarily based on the evolution of the capacities of the form. Okay, so let's say the evolution of the deer. The deer as a species, with each step, perhaps becoming more flexible, more skillful, more adaptable, more rapid, more harmonious in its form, more adjusting to its environment, able to survive in more difficult circumstances, and so on. Stronger, more intelligent, more conscious. All of that is there in the successive steps in the evolution. And a lot of this, in the modern perspective, we will say, is the genetic part of the evolution. Actually, it's not just genetic, but the genes are the most external form of it. There's a huge psychological component which is transmitted. But you see, the evolution is dependent on the species growing. Within that, separately from that, is an individual evolution, where this particular individual soul, if it has grown and organized itself in a particular person in the species, its growth in this lifetime continues where it left off in the next lifetime. So in the human beings, this is more obvious. Whatever may be the current development of the society or the evolution of the biology and the genetic capacity of the human species, I as a consciousness can take off where I left off and continue from there and push the limits. The biology is almost struggling to keep up with the growth of the consciousness. The social development is struggling to keep up with the capacity of the awakening of the individual. Right? So there are two different kinds of evolution. There's one collective evolution which is based more on the form changing and growing in capacity, and the individual evolution which is much more at the level of the consciousness, skipping across forms, using the forms that society and the group consciousness can provide. So in this group evolution, also there is a consciousness growing, which is limited by the form evolution. Because form is not consciousness. Okay? But as the psychic consciousness grows, and especially I said in the context of the integral yoga, where we seek a transformation of the external form itself, Mother described how the new body and the new consciousness form, the new body formed of the new consciousness, will be the materialization of the psychic being itself. That is, the psychic being substantially becoming more and more concrete becoming the substance of our mind, becoming the substance of our life energy, and eventually becoming the substance of our body. At that point, you will have what Sri Aurobindo has described as the supramental being, a new step in evolution. But at that stage, the inner and the outer are united. The psychic being is itself the origin of the substance of its formation. And so the individual evolution of consciousness and the collective evolution of the species and the form of the species, they fuse and join and become one single evolution. Although in expression it will still have a collective life and an individual life. But the gap which is there between these two, and always the struggle, the pull and push between the individual and the collective, that will cease, and there will be a spontaneous harmony between the two, natural to that species, to that consciousness. That's why I said it's a little far in future, but it's useful for us to understand the inevitability of this. And meanwhile, before this happens, the inevitability of the oscillation between the two. Sometimes the individual presiding, sometimes the group presiding, and always the struggle and tension between the two. So in the systems of religious practices and spiritual philosophies, when they speak of dissolution of the ego, the idea is there. But what does it mean and how far does one go in the dissolution? This is the theme now. And the distinction Sri Aurobindo makes is extremely important. In many traditions, this distinction is there. But it is there at a level of experience which is so special that only a few individuals who hold the soul of the tradition may carry it. Often in the actual discussion, people stop short with the idea of dissolution of the ego and a superficial dissolution of the ego without this essential ego being dissolved, leading to some kind of liberation but not the true liberation. And of this we will see examples next time. Many interesting examples. But Sri Aurobindo is uncompromising in everything. Although he unifies everything, the truth must be seen in its essence uncompromisingly. So even in the release from the ego, all the steps are good and helpful, but the reference is something which is uncompromisingly complete, which will be the discussion next time. We have to use this discussion for our understanding, and with the understanding, through a process of introspection, recognizing those tendencies within us. So the best use we can make of the study before we come to the means for the practice, for the release of this step of the ego, is to observe all these tendencies within us. Because within each one of us, all these tendencies and needs are present, including what he has described earlier as the tendency of the mundane goals, the need for the collective, for the individual, the tendencies of the religious, spiritual or philosophical goals, and within those variations, all of these tendencies and needs are within us already. And when we become conscious of them, and through this discussion, put them in right relation to each other, we become more integrated as individuals. The various despairing tendencies which pull in different directions are now brought in alignment around some common essential center and truth. And we no more see them as contradictory. Now they fall into some kind of a common overall movement. So within us, there is a need for a personal fulfillment of the ego sense. I need to achieve, I need to fulfill, I need to realize and do something worthwhile and assert my individuality in life. Yes, it's there. I need to serve the larger cause. I am part of a community, if nothing else, my family or society or humanity. I have to serve this larger cause and assist in its growth. That also is true. I have to get free of this illusion of my separate individuality and find my true soul, my psychic being, myself. That also is true. And all this idea of self, etc., is all illusory. Everything will pass with the passing of this body. That also is true. And at the end of the day, whatever I may do, I will always remain separate from the divine. However much I may experience closeness, immersion, even identity, something will always remain distinct. That also is true. All of these are there before us. And instead of seeing them as contradictions, we align them. There is only one thing which is important: to find, know and possess the divine and live in it. For the divine is our true aim, for which we must aspire. In that, according to our temperament and our need, we will serve, find, know and serve the divine in individuals, in the collective, in our own self-fulfillment, etc. The means for that, some of them have been discussed in the Yoga of Works before. He quickly does a summary of that in the text which we have quickly read now, which we will discuss next time. All of these things will come in. But having done all this now, we keep our primary focus around this. And all these are secondary aspects and facets around which they will find their fulfillment. Yes, we will serve humanity also. Some of us by working on ourselves at an individual level and our immediate environment. Some of us by overt activism in life, helping to change even society in various ways, because that is natural to our temperament. But we will do it because that's our best way to serve the divine in society and also within us, and deepen our relationship with the divine and find the divine and realize and live in the divine and so on. And it was in this way that the mother created the ashram as a space in which one could dedicate ourselves to this ideal without struggling to survive. Now, an ideal like this can be done much more easily if you do not have constantly the preoccupation of where will my food come tomorrow. And at that time it's very difficult to say, I will starve for the sake of the divine. It doesn't work. So I have to work to get my food and the food for my family and etc. etc. So she said it was her dream to create a space where people would be free from these needs of survival so that they could dedicate themselves entirely to this realization of the divine, both individually and in the collective and in all activities of life. And therefore she created everything. We had music, we had dance, we had physical exercises, we had poetry, we had all kinds of activities, an entire complete village life within the framework of a spiritual community. To many at that time, where spirituality was ascetic by definition, it was a confusion of values. Yoga they saw as contrary to bhoga, meaning enjoyment. And here you had people enjoying their lives and going to music programs, singing and writing poetry, and of course working in various activities. And art was as much important as the work in the fields for growing the food and the farming. So the whole value system was very different because everything is for the fulfillment of the divine. That was done in a limited scale, with a selection of people and with a certain established framework which was narrow. Having established this base, the same concept was widened to the scale of a township in Auroville. And the same principle moves, but now with more complexities because the scale opens up with greater complexities, but still the same goal, which become a link point for this energy and realization to open out to all humanity. And so this was their work once set in motion, there's nothing which can stop it. It is only a question of realization and fulfillment, however long it takes. And each step that we grow individually and in our collective life, humanity moves forward. And that's our way of service, most directly, most helpfully. So we'll continue this text next time. Next Friday, we will not have the class because of the retreat, and we will continue this text on the Friday after, which is 26th. There will not be a video also on the Friday for those who are used to coming, but the Sunday class will be as usual.